The old pickup truck rattled loudly as Rose Mitchell pulled into the driveway. The engine coughed twice before finally going silent. For a moment, she just sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the large two-story house in front of her. Warm lights glowed behind the windows. Laughter drifted faintly from inside. Her family was already eating dinner. Rose glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 6:47 p.m. 7 minutes late. She sighed softly. Lord knows Carol's gonna mention that, she murmured to herself. And she was right. The moment Rose stepped through the front door carrying 2 grocery bags, her daughter-in-law looked up from the dining table with immediate irritation. Well, finally. Carol barely tried to hide the annoyance in her voice. We were about to eat without you. Rose gave a small apologetic smile. Traffic near the pharmacy was bad. Carol's eyes dropped toward the grocery bags. You got the organic almond milk, right? Ethan only drinks the organic one now. Rose nodded quickly. Yes, honey. I got it. And the low-sodium turkey? Yes. Carol sighed dramatically and leaned back in her chair. Good. Last time you bought the wrong one. Rose quietly walked toward the kitchen without responding. After 3 years of living in her son's house, she had learned something important. Silence kept the peace. The kitchen smelled like rosemary chicken and garlic bread. Expensive candles burned near the dining table, filling the room with artificial cinnamon. Everything looked beautiful. Magazine beautiful. The kind of house Rose used to admire in furniture catalogs years ago. Now she lived in it. And somehow had never felt less at home. Grandma. A small voice pulled her from her thoughts. Her 10-year-old granddaughter Lily sat at the table scrolling on her phone. You forgot my science poster. Rose blinked. Oh, sweetheart, I thought your project wasn't until Friday. Lily rolled her eyes dramatically. I told you it changed. Before Rose could apologize, Carol cut in sharply. She did tell you. Rose lowered her eyes slightly. I'm sorry. Carol exchanged a quick look with her husband Daniel, Rose's oldest son. That look hurt more than the words. Because it carried exhaustion. Embarrassment. Like caring for her had become another burden they were both tired of carrying. Daniel finally spoke, though he never looked directly at his mother. It's okay. I'll print another one at work tomorrow. But his tone wasn't comforting. It was impatient. Like a man trying very hard not to lose his temper. Rose nodded quietly and began unpacking groceries. No one offered to help her. No one noticed her hands shaking slightly from arthritis as she lifted the heavy bags onto the counter. At 71 years old, even small tasks had started becoming harder. But she tried not to complain. After all, Daniel and Carol had graciously allowed her to stay with them after Harold died. At least that's how Carol described it to people. Rose still remembered the night she sold her own home. The little yellow house she and Harold had lived in for 43 years. She sold it because Daniel's business was collapsing. He had shown up at her door pale and desperate, talking about loans, investors, payroll problems. I just need a little help to stay afloat, he had told her. And Rose had helped. Because mothers did that. She used almost every dollar from the sale to save his company. At the time, Daniel cried and hugged her tightly. You saved my life, Mom. Now 3 years later, his company was thriving. New house. Luxury cars. Private school for the kids. And somehow, Rose had become the inconvenient leftover piece of the life he no longer wanted to remember. Dinner passed with the usual rhythm. Carol talked about a charity event. Daniel answered emails between bites of food. The kids barely looked up from their phones. Rose mostly stayed quiet, eating slowly while the conversation moved around her like she wasn't really part of it. Then Carol suddenly laughed. Oh my God, wait until you hear this. Daniel looked up briefly. What? Carol smirked as she cut into her chicken. Vanessa from my Pilates class just put her mother-in-law in one of those luxury retirement communities. Rose felt something tighten in her stomach immediately. She says it's amazing, Carol continued. Private nurses. Activities. Massage therapy. Honestly, it sounds better than most hotels. Daniel gave a distracted nod. MHM. Carol glanced toward him carefully. They even handle memory care. That got his attention. Rose kept her eyes on her plate. Her appetite disappeared instantly. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Probably costs a fortune. Not really, Carol replied casually. Not compared to what we spend here. Silence. Small. Heavy. Rose suddenly became very aware of every sound in the room. The clink of silverware. The hum of the refrigerator. The pounding of her own heartbeat. Carol took a sip of wine before continuing. I'm just saying, eventually we may need to discuss options. Options. Rose knew exactly what that word meant. Daniel rubbed his jaw tiredly. Can we not do this right now? I'm being realistic, Carol said quietly. You know things are getting harder. Rose lowered her fork carefully onto the plate. Her hands suddenly felt cold. I can still take care of myself, she said softly. Neither Daniel nor Carol answered immediately. And somehow, that silence hurt worst of all. Finally Carol forced a small smile. Of course you can, Rose. Nobody's saying otherwise. But everyone at the table knew she didn't mean it. A few minutes later, Daniel's phone rang. He stood and walked toward the living room to answer it. Carol watched him leave before leaning closer across the table. Then in a lower voice she spoke. I just think everyone would be happier with more space. Rose looked at her quietly. Carol smiled politely. But there was no warmth in it. Only calculation. Only exhaustion. And in that moment, Rose realized something painful. Carol wasn't being cruel because she hated her. She was being cruel because she truly believed Rose no longer belonged there. The realization settled heavily into Rose's chest. For years, she had kept trying to make herself smaller, quieter, easier. She folded laundry, cooked meals, picked up the children from school, stayed out of the way, apologized constantly, and somehow, it still wasn't enough. Later that night, long after everyone went upstairs, Rose sat alone in the garage. The old pickup truck rested quietly in the corner beneath layers of dust. Harold's truck. The same truck he drove for nearly 20 years before cancer took him. Daniel had wanted to sell it several times. It's junk, Mom. But Rose always refused. Because it was the only thing left that still felt like home. She ran her fingers gently along the faded red paint. And for the first time in a very long while, she let herself cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quiet tears falling in the dark while the rest of the house slept peacefully above her. Then something happened. Something small. But life-changing. From upstairs, voices drifted faintly through the garage ceiling. Daniel and Carol. Arguing. Rose never meant to listen. But then she heard her own name. We can't keep doing this forever, Carol whispered harshly. I know, Daniel replied. She's my mother. And I'm tired, Daniel. A long silence followed. Then came the sentence that shattered something inside Rose forever. Maybe she should just go somewhere else. Rose didn't sleep that night. She sat alone in the garage long after the house had gone quiet, staring at Harold's old pickup truck while Carol's words echoed endlessly in her mind. Maybe she should just go somewhere else. Not angry. Not emotional. Just tired. And somehow that hurt more. Because Rose realized something painful. Her family wasn't struggling with the decision anymore. They had already made it. The only question left was when. Around 3 in the morning, Rose slowly stood from the folding chair beside the truck. Her knees ached immediately. For a moment, she pressed one hand against the dusty hood to steady herself. The garage was cold and smelled faintly of oil and old cardboard boxes. Above her, the house remained silent. Safe. Warm. Comfortable. A home she no longer belonged to. Rose wiped her eyes carefully before walking back inside. No one heard her moving through the hallway. No one woke up as she entered the small guest room at the back of the house. The room that used to be Daniel's office before she moved in. She looked around quietly. Most of her life had been reduced to this tiny space. A single bed. A lamp. 2 drawers. A few framed photographs. That was all. Rose opened the closet slowly and pulled out an old suitcase with a broken zipper. She placed it on the bed. Then she began packing. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just calmly. Like someone finally accepting something they had known for a very long time. 3 sweaters. 2 pairs of jeans. Her medicine. Harold's watch. Family photographs she doubted anyone else would want. Every few minutes, she stopped moving and listened to the silence of the house. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing. By sunrise, the suitcase was ready. Rose sat on the edge of the bed staring at it for a long moment. Then her eyes drifted toward the framed photo beside the lamp. It was taken almost 20 years earlier. Daniel stood beside her smiling proudly in his college graduation gown, while Harold wrapped an arm around both of them. Back then, Daniel still looked at her like she was important. Back then, she still believed love stayed the same forever. Rose picked up the photograph gently and slipped it into her bag. Then she whispered softly into the quiet room. I hope one day you remember who loved you first. The words nearly broke her. But she kept moving. Outside, the Texas sky was just beginning to brighten when Rose carried her suitcase into the garage. The pickup truck looked even older in the morning light. Faded red paint. Rust along the doors. One cracked headlight. Harold used to call it Old Betty. Daniel called it garbage. Rose touched the hood lightly. Well, she murmured, forcing a tiny smile. Looks like it's just you and me now. The truck started on the third try. The engine rattled violently before finally settling into a rough growl. Rose glanced once toward the house. Large windows. Perfect landscaping. Luxury SUV in the driveway. The life she sacrificed everything to help build. For a brief moment, she wondered if she should leave a note. But what would she even say? Sorry for becoming a burden? Instead, she quietly shifted the truck into reverse and pulled away from the curb. No gudvie. No dramatic enfrentación. Just the soft sound of tires rolling down an empty suburban street before sunrise. And just like that, Rose Mitchell disappeared. At first, no one panicked. When Daniel woke up that morning, he simply assumed his mother had gone to the grocery store. By noon, Carol sounded mildly irritated. She didn't even tell anyone where she was going. Daniel shrugged while typing on his laptop. She probably needed space. But by evening, Rose still hadn't returned. Her room was empty. The closet cleared out. Suitcase gone. That was when Daniel finally noticed the truck missing from the garage. For a long moment, he simply stared at the empty parking space. Something unfamiliar twisted in his chest. Not fear. Not yet. Guilt. Carol crossed her arms. She'll come back, she said immediately. She has nowhere else to go. Daniel wanted to believe that. So he did. Meanwhile, Rose kept driving. The highway stretched endlessly beneath the Texas sun, while old country music crackled softly through the truck radio. At first, she didn't know where she was going. Only that she couldn't stay. The farther she drove from Dallas, the lighter the air seemed to feel inside her chest. Not happy. Not free. Not yet. But quieter. For the first time in years, nobody was criticizing her breathing too loudly in the next room. Nobody sighed when she forgot something. Nobody looked embarrassed when she entered a conversation. It was just her. And the road. By late afternoon, Rose stopped at a small roadside diner outside Amarillo. The waitress couldn't have been older than 19. You traveling alone? The girl asked while pouring coffee. Rose hesitated slightly before nodding. Looks that way. The waitress smiled warmly. Well, honey, you picked the hottest week in Texas history to do it. Rose laughed softly. A real laugh. Small. Rusty. But real. And somehow, that tiny moment almost made her cry. Because the young waitress had spoken to her with more kindness in 30 seconds than she'd felt inside her own home in months. After dinner, Rose sat in the truck watching the sunset paint the desert sky deep orange and gold. For the first time since Harold died, no one needed anything from her. No dinner to cook. No chores. No careful walking on eggshells. Just silence. And strangely, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. Rose leaned back against the cracked leather seat and closed her eyes briefly. She thought about Daniel as a little boy. Thought about school lunches packed before sunrise. Little league games. Birthday cakes. Doctor visits. Years and years of loving someone with your entire heart. How strange, she thought, that motherhood could spend decades building a home inside another person. Only to one day realize you no longer lived there. The thought stayed with her long after the stars appeared above the highway. Then Rose opened her eyes, started the truck again, and kept driving west. 3 days after leaving Texas, Rose Mitchell found herself parked beside a lonely gas station somewhere in New Mexico, staring at her reflection in the truck mirror. She looked exhausted, gray hair loosely tied back, wrinkles deeper from too many sleepless nights, a faded denim jacket hanging from narrow shoulders that suddenly seemed smaller than she remembered. For a long moment, she barely recognized herself. Then she laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because for the first time in years, nobody was telling her who she needed to be. The thought felt strange, uncomfortable, even. Rose stepped out of the truck slowly and stretched her aching back, while the desert wind swept dust across the empty highway. The world out here felt enormous. Wide skies, long roads, tiny towns scattered beneath endless sunsets. It reminded her how small her life had become before she left. Back in Dallas, every day revolved around staying out of the way. Now each morning arrived without instructions, and she still didn't know what to do with that freedom. Inside the gas station, a teenage cashier looked up from his phone. "Cool truck," he said casually. Rose blinked in surprise. "You think so?" "Yeah," he shrugged. "Looks vintage." Rose nearly laughed again. Vintage. Daniel used to call it junk. Funny how the same thing could sound worthless to one person and valuable to another. She bought coffee and a microwaved breakfast sandwich before heading back outside. Then she noticed something sitting near the truck bed. A small cardboard sign. Handmade jewelry, $5. An older Navajo woman sat quietly beneath a sun-faded umbrella beside a folding table filled with bracelets and necklaces. Rose hesitated before walking over. The woman smiled warmly. "You traveling alone?" Rose nodded. "Looks like it." The woman studied her face for a moment longer than most people did. Then she said something unexpected. "You have the eyes of someone who stayed too long." The words hit Rose so hard she almost stopped breathing. For a second, she couldn't speak. Because somehow, a complete stranger had understood her better in 10 seconds than her own family had in years. Rose swallowed carefully. "What makes you say that?" The woman shrugged lightly. "I've seen that look before." She handed Rose a small silver bracelet with turquoise stones. "For courage," she said simply. Rose tried to pay for it. The woman refused. And as Rose drove away 20 minutes later, she kept glancing at the bracelet wrapped around her wrist. For courage. She wasn't sure she had any yet. But maybe she was starting to. That afternoon, Rose pulled into a small roadside motel near Albuquerque. The sign flickered vacancy in faded red letters. It wasn't much, but it was clean, quiet, and cheap. The motel owner, a middle-aged man named Frank, handed her an old-fashioned room key attached to a giant plastic tag. "You passing through?" he asked. Rose smiled faintly. "I think so." "You know where you're headed?" That question lingered for a moment. Then Rose answered honestly. "No." Frank nodded slowly like he understood more than she said out loud. "Well," he replied, "sometimes that's the best way to travel." That night, Rose sat on the edge of the motel bed eating vending machine crackers while old reruns played quietly on television. Outside, headlights occasionally swept across the thin curtains. The room smelled faintly like dust and laundry detergent. And for the first time in a very long while, Rose felt calm. Not happy, not healed, but calm. No tension in the walls. No careful listening for signs of irritation upstairs. No fear of becoming inconvenient. Just stillness. She reached for the remote to turn off the television, when suddenly her phone buzzed. "Daniel." Rose stared at the screen. Her chest tightened instantly. The phone rang again, then stopped. A few seconds later, another call came. Then another. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. Rose hesitated before pressing play. "Mom, hey." Daniel sounded tired. Frustrated. Not emotional. "Listen, Carol's upset and the kids are asking questions. Can you just call us back?" A pause. "We're worried about you." Rose closed her eyes. For years, hearing concern in her son's voice would have broken her completely. But now, something about the message felt incomplete. Like worry wasn't the only reason he was calling. Maybe not even the biggest one. The voicemail continued. You shouldn't be out there alone. Another pause. Then quietly. This whole thing is getting a little dramatic. Rose opened her eyes slowly. Dramatic. The word settled heavily inside her chest. Not painful anymore. Just clarifying. She deleted the voicemail. Then turned off her phone completely. And for the first time in her life, she chose silence for herself instead of for someone else. The next morning, Rose stopped at a small diner outside Santa Fe. The place was nearly empty except for a few truck drivers drinking coffee near the counter. Rose ordered pancakes and sat near the window. Halfway through breakfast, she noticed a young waitress watching her curiously. The girl looked maybe 20 years old with dark braids and tired eyes. You mind if I ask you something? She said while refilling Rose's coffee. Rose smiled lightly. Depends what it is. The waitress grinned. What's your story? Rose laughed softly. My story? Yeah. You look like somebody in a movie. Rose nearly choked on her coffee. A movie about arthritis and bad decisions? The waitress burst out laughing. A real laugh. Loud enough that even the truck drivers smiled. And suddenly, Rose found herself talking. Not deeply. Not about Daniel. But little things. How she used to bake pies. How her husband loved old country music. How she hadn't traveled in decades. The waitress listened carefully to every word. Like it mattered. Before Rose left, the girl hesitated. Can I ask one more thing? Sure. Would you let me record a little video of you? Rose blinked. A video? For my TikTok, the girl explained quickly. I make these little travel stories about people I meet. Rose almost said no immediately. But then the waitress smiled. You just seem interesting. Interesting. Nobody had called Rose interesting in years. So finally, she laughed softly and shrugged. Well, alright, I guess. The waitress pulled out her phone. And without realizing it, Rose Mitchell unknowingly stepped into the moment that was about to change her entire life forever. Rose didn't think much about the video after she left the diner. The waitress had thanked her, posted the clip somewhere online, and that was that. At least, that's what Rose assumed. She spent the next 2 days driving through Arizona, stopping at tiny desert towns that looked frozen in time. Old motels, dusty gas stations, roadside diners with faded Coca-Cola signs hanging in the windows. The farther she traveled, the more the world seemed to slow down around her. And slowly, so did the ache inside her chest. One evening, Rose parked beside a scenic overlook just outside Sedona. The sunset painted the red cliffs in deep shades of orange and gold while warm wine drifted through the open truck windows. She sat quietly eating a fast food hamburger when headlights suddenly pulled up beside her. A young couple stepped out of an SUV. The woman looked startled the moment she saw Rose. Oh my God, she whispered. Rose blinked in confusion. The young woman hurried closer, holding her phone tightly. Are you Grandma Rose? Rose frowned slightly. I'm sorry. The couple exchanged excited looks. The man laughed in disbelief. It's really her. Rose stared at them both like they had lost their minds. The young woman quickly opened TikTok on her phone and held it out. There, she said breathlessly. That's you. Rose adjusted her glasses carefully. And froze. On the screen was the short diner video. Just 30 seconds long. Rose laughing softly over coffee while saying, I guess when you get old enough, you stop realizing you still matter to people. The clip had music behind it. Soft piano. Simple subtitles. And beneath it, 14.8 million views. Rose nearly dropped the phone. What in heaven's name? The young couple burst out laughing. We've been following your videos all week. Videos. Rose repeated weakly. The woman nodded excitedly. People are calling you Grandma Rose online. Rose stared at the screen in complete disbelief. Thousands upon thousands of comments flooded beneath the video. Protect this woman at all costs. Why am I crying in a Taco Bell parking lot right now? Someone find Grandma Rose and give her a TV show. Her family better realize what they lost. Rose's chest tightened at that last comment. She quickly looked away. The young man smiled warmly. My grandma passed away last year, he said quietly. Watching your videos kinda reminds me of her." Something about his voice softened Rose immediately. For a moment nobody spoke. Then the woman carefully asked, "Would it be okay if we took a picture with you?" Rose laughed nervously. "With me? Honey, I'm just an old woman driving around in a broken truck." "Exactly," the girl replied. And somehow, that answer nearly made Rose cry. By the next morning, things became even stranger. Rose stopped at a small grocery store in Flagstaff. Halfway through the produce aisle, a teenager gasped loudly, "Mom, that's her." Suddenly 3 different people were staring, then smiling, then approaching her. One woman hugged her tightly without warning. "I just want to say thank you," she whispered emotionally. Rose stood frozen in confusion. "For what?" The woman wiped tears from her eyes. "My mom lives alone in Ohio," she admitted. "Your videos made me call her for the first time in months." Rose didn't know what to say, because nobody had ever thanked her for simply existing before. Not in years. By lunchtime, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Unknown numbers, messages, social media notifications she barely understood. The waitress from Santa Fe, her name was Kayla, finally called her directly. "You need to see this," Kayla said breathlessly. Rose sat inside the truck outside a gas station while Kayla explained everything. Apparently after the first video exploded online, people became obsessed with the old woman in the truck. So Kayla posted more clips from their conversation. Then truck drivers who recognized Rose began uploading videos whenever they spotted her on the highway. Soon the internet started tracking her road trip across the Southwest. #Grandma Rose was trending nationwide. Rose rubbed her forehead in disbelief. "This is ridiculous." "No, Kaleri played softly. It's beautiful." Rose leaned back quietly against the truck seat. Outside, desert wind swept dust across the parking lot. "I don't understand why people care so much." Kayla's voice grew gentler. "Because people can tell when someone's hurting." The words settled heavily into Rose's chest. For a long moment she couldn't answer. Then quietly, almost embarrassed, she admitted, "I didn't think anybody noticed me anymore." Silence filled the line for a second. Then Kayla whispered, "That's exactly why they care." Back in Dallas, Daniel Mitchell sat frozen in his office staring at his laptop screen. Carol stood behind him with crossed arms. On the monitor, Rose's face filled the screen beside a headline, "America falls in love with Grandma Rose." Below it, millions of comments poured in every hour. Daniel scrolled silently through videos of his mother smiling shyly at strangers, drinking coffee at diners, laughing beside her truck. The internet adored her. And slowly, the internet began asking questions. Where was her family? Why was she alone? Why did she seem so heartbroken whenever someone mentioned home? Carol paced anxiously behind him. "This is getting out of control." Daniel barely heard her, because for the first time in years, he was truly looking at his mother, not as responsibility, not as inconvenience, but as a person. And the realization made him deeply uncomfortable. Then another video appeared. This one showed Rose sitting quietly beside the truck at sunset. A young voice behind the camera asked gently, "Do you miss your family?" Rose smiled sadly before answering, "You never stop loving your children, even when they stop needing you." Daniel's face went pale. The comments underneath were brutal. "Her kids failed her. Who abandons a mother like this? I hope her family feels ashamed." Carol grabbed the laptop suddenly and slammed it shut. People online don't know the full story. Daniel looked up slowly. But deep down, he knew they did. Maybe not every detail, but enough. And for the first time since Rose disappeared, guilt began turning into something worse. Fear. Because the entire country was starting to see his mother the way he used to when he was little. Kind, gentle, loving. And the more America loved Rose Mitchell, the uglier her children started to look. By the time Rose Mitchell reached Arizona, she was no longer just an old woman driving across America in a rusty truck. She had become a phenomenon. Everywhere she stopped, people recognized her. Truck drivers waved when they passed her on the highway. Waitresses refused to let her pay for coffee. Teenagers asked for selfies. And somehow, the entire thing still felt completely unreal to her. One morning, Rose sat outside a small diner near Phoenix eating scrambled eggs when a little girl approached her table shyly. The child couldn't have been older than 8. "Are you Grandma Rose?" she asked softly. Rose smiled. "I suppose I am." The little girl held out a folded piece of paper. "My mommy cries when she watches your videos," she whispered. "She said you remind her to call her grandma." Rose unfolded the paper carefully. Inside was a crayon drawing of an old red pickup truck beneath a giant yellow sun. And beside it, written in messy handwriting, "You are not forgotten." Rose stared at the drawing so long that her vision blurred. Not forgotten. For years, that was exactly how she had felt. Forgotten inside her own family. Invisible inside her own home. And now somehow, strangers across the country were reminding her she still mattered. The thought overwhelmed her more than fame ever could. Later that afternoon, Kayla called again. "You need to sit down before I tell you this." Rose laughed softly while pumping gas. "Honey, at my age, I'm almost always sitting down." Kayla burst out laughing. Then her voice turned serious. "A national morning show wants to interview you." Rose froze. "What? Live television, Rose?" Rose nearly dropped the gas nozzle. "Oh, absolutely not." "Yes, absolutely yes," Kayla replied immediately. "America loves you." Rose shook her head even though Kayla couldn't see it. "I'm not some celebrity." "No," Kayla said gently. "You're something people trust." The word stayed with Rose long after the call ended, because deep down, she still saw herself the way her family had for years. A burden. An old woman people tolerated out of obligation. But now complete strangers looked at her differently. Like she was valuable. Like her life still carried meaning. And slowly, Rose was beginning to believe them. Back in Dallas, things were falling apart. Daniel's company had begun receiving angry emails after internet users identified him as Rose's son. Customers flooded business pages with comments. "Take care of your mother. She deserved better. How could you let her leave alone?" Carol tried desperately to control the situation. "She's exaggerating everything online," she snapped while pacing across the kitchen. But Daniel barely responded anymore. Because every new video of Rose chipped away at something inside him. One clip showed Rose laughing with strangers around a campfire. Another showed her helping an elderly man change a flat tire outside a diner. And in every single video, she looked lighter, happier, more alive than she ever had inside his house. That realization haunted him. Late one night, Daniel sat alone watching an interview clip on his phone. The host smiled warmly at Rose. "What's the biggest lesson this journey has taught you?" Rose thought quietly for a moment before answering. That loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes from feeling unwanted in a room full of people. Daniel stopped breathing for a second. Because suddenly he remembered every time his mother quietly excused herself from dinner early. Every time she apologized for existing. Every time she made herself smaller so nobody would feel uncomfortable. And worst of all, he remembered noticing it. And doing nothing. Daniel lowered his head into his hands. For the first time in years, shame hit him hard enough to hurt. A week later, Rose arrived at a small roadside motel outside Tucson. The property was old and half-empty, with faded turquoise doors and flickering lights along the parking lot. The owner, an elderly widower named Miguel, recognized her immediately. "You're the lady from the internet," he said warmly. Rose smiled shyly. "Afraid so." "Miguel Chequel. Well, your room's free tonight." "Oh no, honey, I can pay." "You already did," he replied softly. Rose frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Miguel leaned against the counter. "My wife passed away 3 years ago," he admitted quietly. "After your videos went viral, my daughter called me for the first time in 8 months." Emotion caught briefly in his voice. She said she didn't want me feeling alone anymore. Rose's eyes filled instantly. Miguel smiled gently. "So thank you." That night, Rose sat outside her motel room watching the desert sky darken slowly above the mountains. Miguel joined her carrying 2 cups of coffee. For a while neither spoke. Then Rose quietly asked, "Do you ever regret giving everything to your children?" Miguel looked out toward the highway lights in the distance. No, he answered honestly. Then after a pause, but I regret forgetting to keep something for myself. The sentence hit Rose deeply, because she had spent her entire life pouring love into other people, until there was almost nothing left inside her for herself. And somewhere along the way, she forgot she deserved care too. The realization changed something inside her that night. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. The next morning, Rose walked slowly through the motel courtyard while workers repaired broken railings near the office. Several elderly guests sat quietly outside their rooms alone. One woman crocheted silently beside a vending machine. An older man stared blankly at the highway for nearly an hour. And suddenly, Rose saw herself in every single one of them. People once loved deeply, people once needed desperately, now aging quietly in the corners of the world. Invisible, forgotten. Her chest tightened. Then an idea slowly began forming. Wild. Impossible. Beautiful. That evening, Rose sat inside the truck with Harold's old watch resting in her palm. For a long time, she stared at the motel sign glowing outside her window. Then finally, she whispered softly into the silence. Maybe this isn't the end of the road after all. And for the very first time since leaving Texas, Rose Mitchell wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to build a new life.